by using a budgeting tool such as Mint is a really great relationship tool. I give an example of this, that when my husband and I first got married, he was going to Home Depot all the time. And I was just like, Chris, you cannot be going to Home Depot all the time. You're spending way too much money there. Well, I started tracking our expenses then, and I realized it ended up, I think it was about 0.5% of all of our expenses were going to Home Depot. So I realized that I needed to just get off of his case about Home Depot because it really wasn't having that big of an impact. So I genuinely believe also it's a great communication tool for couples. And some people ask about, a little bit more about Mint. So Mint is actually created by Intuit, and Intuit is also the creator of Quicken and QuickBooks. So it used to be that everyone used Quicken, and I actually did run into someone recently who still does use Quicken. I didn't even know that it was still out there. But essentially, this is the free version of Quicken. And I really like it because you can access it on your computer, but I usually prefer the app on my iPhone. I almost prefer the app better than the online version. So let me see, am I in the presentation? There we go. So here's the first step, and actually I'm just going to take a step back before I go on to that page. So the first piece that you'll want to do when you go into Mint is you set up an account. And then I tell people, number 2, what you should do is turn off all the alerts. On the main screen, there is when you log on online, there's also a way to do it on your phone. But by the alert section, you can click on the settings button. And from there, you can get to a menu. You can see in the middle of the page where it says send advice emails. I recommend that you turn that off. And then down below, you can also turn off a lot of the alerts that you receive. As I mentioned, Mint is a free software, and the way that Mint makes their money is through advertising. So companies such as, for example, Chase will pay Mint to send email notifications out to people that say, hey, have you thought about refinancing your mortgage? So if you want to get rid of all that advertising and everything that goes along with Mint, you'll want to go under alerts and turn that off, and then select off for a lot of the alerts. You'll see that some of the alerts might be very useful, like it can show you if there's a low balance in your account or if there's bills coming up. But for the most part, I think most people don't really want to see the alerts. I recommend just go ahead and turn those off. So then after you've turned off the alerts, you can add your accounts. You go in here and you type into the search bar, search by institution, and then you'll be inputting your user ID and password. And like any aggregation type of software, it may ask you some of the security questions that you set up with your institution. So again, for example, if you bank at Bank of America, and Bank of America has some security questions built in, not only will you have to put in your user ID and password, but a lot of times you have to put in the security questions as well. So then the next step is to go back and categorize expenses. I usually recommend when people go in for the first time that they categorize 3 months worth of expenses. So go back 3 months. Now, again, this is showing I took these screenshots from the online version, so you can categorize it, obviously, under the category section. I personally prefer to do my categorization on my iPhone or my iPad because I think it's just a little bit easier to click around with that. But anyway, you can all find what area makes sense. So from these categories, you've gone back and categorized expenses for 3 months. You then use that information to create your initial budget. So to create a budget, you go into the budgets area and you click on this button to create a budget. And then you'll see that you can choose various categories to set a budget. You can even set custom categories. So there's a few really important tricks to know about this. Number 1 is that you have to make sure that whatever categories you set as your budget, that's also how you categorize your expenses. So I recommend that people try not to have more than like 10 to 15 line items. 10 is really 12 is ideal. So when I say line items, I mean budget categories, because otherwise it's a little bit much to track. The other thing to know about how Mint is set up is that they have these larger categories, so the auto and transport and bills and utilities. And under each of these larger categories, then they have the subcategories. So the one that I have highlighted, the auto and transport, some of the subcategories are auto insurance, auto and payment, gas and fuel, etc. And what will happen is anytime you categorize an expense as any of these subcategories, it will aggregate it all under the bigger category. So I usually recommend, other than in some specific situations, which I'll talk about in a minute, I usually recommend that you keep the budget items, so where you're going to set your budgets, that you stay at these high level categories. Just because, while Mint will automatically categorize most of your expenses, and I do recommend that you go in and take a look at it just to make sure that they're categorized correctly. I find that when I'm using it, sometimes, I can't remember when I'm going through to categorize my expenses. Okay, was that insurance or what was it? And so it just helps by if you put the main budget in the big category, in the major category, because any expenses that you classify as auto insurance or auto payment or gas and fuel or parking or any of those will then come up. They will show under the auto and transport category. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Okay, got it. And then, as I mentioned, you can create custom categories, as you can see in that green text there. And the other nice item here, it's sort of grayed out because I have this menu, maybe on one of my other slides. This is better. If you look on the right of this slide, so when you go to create the budget, it's nice because it will tell you how much you've spent average a month on that expense. So that gives you a really good place to start when you're creating that expense. So this slide is meant to show you what to do with non-monthly expenses. So in this example that Mint provided, this is a situation where someone was paying their auto insurance once a year. It may be that. It may be if you're making estimated quarterly tax payments once a quarter, that could apply. So it's any non-monthly expense. So what you go in is you create a category for that, and I'm going to go back. So if you were on this screen, you would have, in this situation with auto insurance, you would have gone under auto and transport and then clicked on auto insurance. And then what you do from there is you tell it that it doesn't happen every month. So you click on every few months, as it is in here. And so in this situation, this sample, the auto insurance is $1,700 every 12 months. And then, because this one is paid once a year, you say, okay, when is the next bill due? And so in this situation, the next bill was due in July 2016. So if I flip to the next page, so this is going back out to the main budget page of Mint. What you can see is how what it did was it took that annual expense divided by 12 and came up with $141. I don't know why that's slightly off. I think it has to do with a rounding issue. But $141 a month, and it shows that this budget is already spent for the month. So what this does is it's a way of spending every month in a way that you're setting aside money for those non-regular expenses. Because, so for example, in this month, for this particular client, they would have $141 of their budget they didn't spend that month, And so theoretically that should be saved up over the year until then the expense hits every 12 months, and then that expense can be paid. Does that make sense about the non-monthly expenses?
Yes.
Yes, definitely.
Okay, great. Then the next thing I recommend is to look at the budget that you create and make sure that it isn't more than your income. So that's a somewhat obvious thing. Now, one thing I will tell you that's sort of quirky is that Mint will, you can't really see it on, actually you can. So see on this left side where it says there's $10,700 spent of this $31 or almost $32,000 budget. That is a little bit deceiving because of the one-time expenses. Because what I'm telling you is this dollar amount, this budget that it's set, is going to be different every single month. Because, for example, in the month where the auto insurance is due, it will put that full dollar amount into the total of the budget. So what you need to do to see what the actual monthly budget is, you have to add it up yourself. So in this situation, so they've budgeted $1,400 towards other auto and transport, and then $141 towards auto insurance, and $570 towards bills and utilities. You'll actually have to add those up manually because, again, if all of your expenses in here were just monthly expenses, then you can use the number that Mint gives you. But otherwise, if you have expenses in there that aren't monthly budgets or monthly expenses, then that dollar amount doesn't give you a true picture of what your average monthly budget is. Does that make sense?
Yes.
I didn't realize that number on the left wasn't accurate, so that's definitely helpful.
Yeah, it's accurate if you only have monthly expenses in there. But once you start adding in some of the irregular expenses, then again, that dollar amount is going to change every single month, and it's based off of the items that you're actually paying for that month, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So then also, when you're going and creating this budget, you want to create any wiggle room, I guess, if you will, for your other goals. So whether it's paying down credit card debt or creating more of an emergency fund. So let's say that your goal is to put $200 towards the credit cards or $300 a month into an emergency fund. You just need to make sure that there's that differential between your income and what the expenses are. Let's see, what other notes do I have here? And again, as I mentioned, it's really important to know that once you create this budget, then I recommend to go, so again, you put your accounts in, you went back and you aggregated 3 months worth of expenses, then you go and you create the budget. Well, I then recommend that you go back and just briefly look at those 3 months worth of expenses and make sure that everything that you categorized is actually falling into one of the budgets that you created. So if I go back a few screens, let's say, for example, that you didn't create a budget at all for health and fitness, but you have some expenses categorized as that. Those expenses then don't come through to show you, they don't even show up as being spent in your budget. So you need to make sure that the expenses correspond with one of the categories that you've used, that you've created a budget for.
Okay.
Then the next piece is I always recommend, so then you've got yourself set up, you've created the budget, you have everything categorized correctly. It sounds like a ton of work, and it is a lot of work up front, or a fair amount. I usually say it takes about 2 hours to get everything set up. But then once you have everything set up, the main goal is I usually tell people find a time every week to just look at it. So for me, I take my kids to swimming lessons at 4:30 on Fridays, and while I'm sitting there at swimming lessons, that's when I look at my Mint. And so I look at the expenses over the last week. Were they categorized correctly? I look at where the budget is. I don't think I have a slide that shows it, but it's really nice on, especially I know on the iPhone app, on the budgets, it will draw this little faint gray line of where you're at within the month. So if you're on the 10th of the month, there will be a gray line approximately 1/3 into each budget line. Yeah, I don't think it's showing it on this one. And so it will show you, so for expenses such as food or shopping or things that happen throughout the month, it will show you, okay, are you doing better than you should be by this point in the month? Have you been spending too much in this category? Do you need to tone it down? So it's just good to have a weekly check-in on where your spending is for the month. Again, it doesn't show real well on this slide, but on the app, it will show you overall where your overall spending is for the month. But I really recommend that you look at each category, because there's certain categories where you're going to spend the entire budget at the beginning of the month, possibly. So, for example, if you pay your mortgage towards the beginning of the month, your entire housing budget will be pretty much taken up right away. So I recommend for people to look at the various categories when they look at it each week. Then we have, so there's a new area of Mint that I'm really excited about. I think it's new, or else I just saw it for the first time a few weeks ago. Maybe it's been there forever, but I just saw it a few weeks ago. And it's on setting goals. And so I'll actually scroll to the next one. Some of the pre-built goals they have are paying off credit card debt, paying off loans, save for an emergency fund, retirement. So there's all these different pre-built goals. This one that I grabbed a sample from Mint on was for setting an emergency fund. So this person has the goal of having a $100,000 emergency fund. So what they did was they went in and they put that emergency fund, which, by the way, is a really big emergency fund. So most people shouldn't be comparing themselves to that. But so what they did in here was they said, we want $100,000 in our emergency fund, and then it allows you to then link an account. So in this situation, they probably linked it to their savings account, which currently has $7,500 in it. And then you put a time frame. It looks like this person wanted to complete it by March of 2017. And so what it does, then it calculates how much needs to be done per month. And you'll see that this person is a little bit ahead of their goal, because you can see the white tiny circle is where the person should be this far into the goal, but they're a little bit ahead of it. So it tracks for goals. So this is a great thing if you're wanting to track on paying down credit card debt or saving towards something. So that is the end of my Mint demonstration. What other questions do you have about Mint?
So whenever we created Mint account and we did all our bank logins, it took my business account information into Mint and has sort of used that to feed it. Is there a way to separate that? Because the business expenses and the business payments aren't really part of the household expenses?
Mm-hmm. So there's two things. One is I'm almost positive there's a way to turn that account off. I believe it's under settings. So I'll look into that and get back to you on that one. But second of all, I also you could just create. There's a option in the categories, which is just business services. So for some people, they might create just an expense and they just categorize any expenses that come through that account there. But for a lot of people, that doesn't work. So I will look into see how you go about turning that off. I know I've seen it. I just can't remember it off the top of my head.
Okay, cool. I wondered about that because on your on the Spari interface, you can delete certain accounts within an account, but I couldn't figure out how to do it on Mint. So that's good that we can do that.
Yeah, I know there's a way. I'm logged in on my other screen into Mint, but I think it will take me a little bit to find how to do that. So I'll look at it and then get back to you on that.
Okay.
Any other questions?
Beth, I think that my question or comment is around really budgeting. I mean, the fact that budgets are kind of the foundation of everything that we're doing. And I know I keep hearing, and I've talked to people about creating an effective budget versus an ineffective budget. And you kind of talked about this through the Mint process of highlighting kind of the top areas, not making it too granular. But can you kind of give some tips on how to actually make a budget that works?
So that's a really good question, and I'm going to start to answer it in a way that's not seeming like I'm answering your question, but I promise I will. So I always tell people when creating a budget, if you will, that you know how much money you make, and you know what your fixed expenses are. So you know what your mortgage is, you know your bills, give or take, but they're pretty much the same throughout the year on utilities or things such as that. So you have your income, you have your bills, and then you have a saving. People have a savings goal. So whether that savings goal is tied to paying down debt or actually saving towards assets, but there's this goal. And I always tell people it doesn't matter what you do with the rest of it, that if you spend it on eating out or buying new shoes, it doesn't matter. Like, that doesn't have an impact on your financial situation. So to Emily's point, is that you don't have to get really, really granular. So, for example, for our Mint, I lump I don't do one separate section for groceries and another one for eating out. Like, I just have food all in one. Or under auto, I don't split out insurance separately unless I was paying it on once a year, but for under auto, I just do all the parking, the car loan payment, everything all in one big category because, again, once you get too many categories, it just gets too diluted. So 10 to 15, I always say really 10 categories is plenty. You may have to add a few extra categories because of those non-monthly expenses. But for the most part, you should just be able, to stick to about 10 categories or so. Does that answer your question, Emily?
Yeah, it does. I think my other question too, I know that given my transition, when I would go to my Mint account, I would be like over on my budget on certain things. So I clearly didn't create a budget correctly, or at least I have lumpy expenses. But how do you think about rebudgeting your budget? I mean, what is your advice about how often you should be updating your budget, or if you go over or go under, how should you be amending those things?
So I really like an area in Mint where it shows sort of what your average spending is over that time period. So I probably go in and update our budget, every 6 to 12 months. I'll go in and look to see really what we were spending over those last several months. Do I need to adjust the budget up or down? So I would say that at least every 6 to 12 months, but it really also needs to just happen anytime you may have like a new goal or something new that you need to make an adjustment in the budget in order to reach that goal. Did that answer your question?
Yep, it did. Thanks.
In the meantime, I do think I found a way to deactivate an account, at least on the online version. On the main page, there on the left side, there's a section that says accounts, and to the right of there's a little button that says edit, and it will show you all the accounts, and you can click on a particular account, and there's a drop down that says status, and you can either choose active or closed. And I have a feeling if you click that it's closed, that it will no longer bring that in. So give that a try and see if that works. And if it doesn't, I really want to figure that out. So
I think that worked.
Well, it zeroes out. It lists it still, but it lists it as $0. So it's still
that's good.
Have any money in it?
Yeah. So see, check after a day to make sure it didn't turn it back on because there's activity going on in that account. But I think that may have at least taken it, because the main thing that you're wanting is you're just not wanting those expenses to flow through to your budget.
Right.
Right.
And it's also kind of skewing the income or
Right.
the cash on hand.
Right. So try that and see if that works.
Okay.
Cool. Thank you.
So any other questions before we wrap up?
Real quick, do you use the trends section at all?
I haven't. I haven't. Now, that doesn't mean that it's not a good tool. For me, again, the main thing, and there's a lot of great graphs on there. You can drill down on certain levels. But for me, the main thing that I look at every week is just the basic budgets graph, and where, the graphs where there's the green line going horizontally, and looking at where I'm at with the budget for that month. But I have not done as much with the trends and some of the other. And the other graph that I really like, as I mentioned before, is I like when I click on each individual budget item to see the average spending in that category over the last 12 months or however long it calculates it, so that I can see if the amount that I've budgeted is accurate.
Okay. I looked at it a little bit, and that's where I initially saw the food and dining costs, but I see how it can get a little. There's a very big other section, and some months are different than other months, so maybe I'll just keep an eye on it.
Yeah. The more you just sort of play around with it, then you figure it out. So. Well, thank you for calling in tonight. Hopefully this was helpful in helping you figure out Mint. And I welcome any questions you ever have about Mint, because I'm always trying to really fine-tune my Mint capabilities. And so any questions or issues you run into it, I would love to hear that and help you figure out a solution.